Well, our first reading in corporate finance has to do with corporate governance and ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors. And so let's look at our introduction to that. Corporate governance, we may as well define it here. It's the internal controls and procedures for managing a company. And the older theory about corporate governance was referred to as shareholder theory. And shareholder theory focuses on creating the most value for shareholders, and that's the primary role of the firm's management. More recently, there are proponents of stakeholder theory, focusing on managing conflicts amongst stakeholder groups. So let's take a look at what that might be. We have the shareholders, of course. But then other stakeholders that have been identified as the board of directors and the senior managers, and there's some overlap there. The employees have a stake in the outcomes of the firm, and also we can add to this list creditors and suppliers and customers and government regulators. And so these are all people that have a stake in the decisions that are made by the firm and the results that the firm attains. One thing to keep in mind is this principal-agent relationship. Now, the principal is the owner, and the agent is hired to act in their interests. So, for example, we talk about insurance agents. They act as the agent of the principal, which is the insurance company. In our context here, shareholders, they employ the board of directors and senior managers to run the company. And there may be a conflict between the interests of this group, directors and senior managers, and the owners of the firm. And one example of that is that the directors and managers may prefer lower risk because they have so much of their wealth and value tied up in their jobs in the firm. They may also hold stock and stock options in the firm. So since they can't diversify this risk away, they may choose a lower risk profile than the owners of the firm, who may own shares in that firm in the context of a well-diversified portfolio. So they would prefer more risk. So there's a little conflict there. Their interests just aren't aligned. We've got some terms here for stakeholder management, just definitions here really. Legal infrastructure has to do with laws. The contractual infrastructure has to deal with contracts. I don't think that should be too hard to remember. Organizational infrastructure is the processes and the management of these stakeholder relationships. And then we can also refer to government infrastructure, which is basically the regulations promulgated by the government under which the firm operates. So in terms of the relationships with shareholders, there's an annual general meeting at which shareholders can vote. And then also there are extraordinary general meetings where there's special resolutions that require a shareholder vote but are not part of the usual annual meeting. Now, you don't have to show up at the annual meeting in person. You can sign a proxy to have somebody vote your shares. And when it comes to the voting, there's two ways that it's done. One is majority. So if we had 5 board seats, we'd have 5 separate elections. And over 50% in any of these elections, well, that selects that board member. Now, an alternative to this is cumulative voting. If we have 5 seats, then each shareholder is going to get 5 votes. Then they put all the candidates for the board on the same list, and those 5 getting the most votes overall are those that are selected. Now, the key difference is with majority voting, if a group had control of 51% of the shares, 51% of the votes, they could select all 5 of the members of the board of directors if we had 5 separate elections. But under cumulative voting, that's not the case. Minority shareholders, because they get now 5 votes if there's 5 board positions, okay, then they can concentrate their votes, and they'd be able to elect 2 out of the 5, even if they only had between 40 and 50%. So, bottom line, with cumulative voting, the minority shareholders have a better opportunity to get representation on the board of directors. The board of directors might be set up as a one-tiered board. That's most often what we see. And they'll include internal directors and external directors. And when we talk about internal directors, these are the senior managers, the CEO, president, CFO, whatever, of the corporation. And external directors are from outside the company. And if they have no other relationships with the company, they're not being paid to finder's fees for acquisitions or consulting fees aside from their board duties, then we call them independent directors. Now, a two-tiered board structure has a supervisory board and a management board. So the management board is the internal directors, and then this separate supervisory board is the external directors. And they can meet together sometimes, and with a one-tiered board, even though they typically meet together, they may have separate meetings of external directors, but it's not as formalized a structure as it is with a two-tiered board. The responsibilities of the board are to set the strategic direction for the company and evaluate senior managers and their compensation and a plan for succession. They approve large investments. If there's acquisitions or change in capital structure, they're going to issue a bunch of debt and buy in a bunch of stock, things like this. These need to be approved by the board. The senior managers just can't undertake these sorts of changes on their own. The board also establishes and monitors the internal controls and sets up the processes for corporate governance. And they also ensure the quality of the financial reporting through both internal audits and their selection and management of external auditors. Board can have several committees. Here's some examples here. One is an audit committee. They oversee the financial reporting and the internal controls of the company. Internal controls refers to the rules and processes regarding use of company assets. And they also recommend the external auditor to the board. There can be a governance committee. A governance committee is there to implement the company's code of ethics and look at the changes in laws and regulations and just make sure that everyone in the company is up to date on these and follows them to ensure that the company is compliant with all the laws and regulations under which they're subject to. The nominations committee would do the search and propose candidates for the board and align board compensation with the company goals. Now, this goes back to the principal agent problem we talked about. We can mitigate this principal agent problem if we set the compensation so that the goals and the incentives of senior management are closer to those of the shareholders. The investment committee would review proposed capital investment projects as well as acquisitions and asset sales. The compensation, also called the remuneration committee, recommends compensation levels and types for directors and senior managers, oversees employee benefit plans and they'll often have also a risk committee that recommends the appropriate risk policy and risk tolerance overall and oversees these risk management processes over time. Now, depending on a company's size and structure, they may not have all of these committees separately. Some committees may take care of a couple of these functions, but these are the general areas that really need to be covered by board committees.